Good afternoon, and welcome to Spotlight on Employment, SSI Work Incentives. It's nice to join you again for National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about SSI and the SSI Work Incentives. If you remember last week, we talked about Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, and the work incentives that went along with that. This week we're going to talk about SSI and the work incentives that go along with that. But let's talk a little bit about how you become eligible for SSI before we go forward with the SSI work incentives. Remember last week we talked about how we become eligible for SSDI, so I wanted to go over how you become eligible for SSI. If you remember, becoming eligible for Social Security benefits in general requires two things for either SSDI and SSI. So you have to have a disability that affects your daily living and is expected to last longer than 1 year or end in death, and that disability has to affect your ability to work and make substantial gainful activity, which in 2023 is $1,470 gross wages. So those two things Social Security looks at to make sure that you meet those requirements prior to determining whether or not you are either eligible for SSDI or SSI. Once you meet those requirements, then Social Security looks to see whether you're eligible for SSDI or SSI. To become eligible for SSI, you do not have to have a work history at all. This is how infants get SSI. SSI does not require any work history. But because of that, there is a resource limit in order to be eligible for SSI, because SSI is a needs-based program. SSI is designed to pay for food and shelter only. There is a resource limit in order to be eligible for SSI. That is $2,000 a month in all the cash that you have and everything that you own combined. Social Security does exclude a few things, being one car, one home, a burial fund or burial plot, an ABLE account, and a couple of other things that we'll talk about next week when we talk about assets and resources. So you can have $2,000 a month in assets and resources, everything that you own and cash in the bank. If you are an eligible couple, meaning that both partners receive SSI, then you are allowed to have $3,000 in assets and resources. Also, because SSI is designed to pay for food and shelter only, there is a limit on the amount of money that a person on SSI can get. In 2023, that is $914, and that is across the board in the entire United States. So whether you live in West Virginia or Boston, Massachusetts, or Los Angeles, California, or Orlando, Florida, everywhere in the United States, if you are on SSI, the most that you can receive is $914 before tax wages. If you are an eligible couple, again, meaning that both partners receive SSI, the maximum amount of money that you can receive is $1,371. SSI beneficiaries get Medicaid immediately. The very first day that you are eligible for SSI, you are eligible for Medicaid. We will talk about the SSI work incentives here in just a minute, but I want to also talk about how SSI wages are calculated. If you recall last week when we talked about SSDI, we talked about when wages were earned. So when wages were looked at a calendar month, what you earned between the 1st and the 31st. That is not the case with SSI. SSI looks at when you were paid, not when you were earned, not when the money was earned. So most of us get paid every 2 weeks. So there are 2 months out of the year that we get 3 paychecks, which most of us are very happy about 3 paycheck months. However, for SSI beneficiaries, that can greatly affect their SSI check and what they get for that month and the following months that come along. And we'll talk about how that works here in just a minute. So that is how you become eligible for SSI. And if you have any questions about SSI eligibility, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will discuss them on the October 25th Calculus with the CWIC discussion. Okay, so let's jump right into SSI work incentives. When you are working on SSI, your SSI check will fluctuate based on what you make at your job. If you recall last week with SSDI, you either got your SSDI check, your entire check, or you got no check. With SSI, that's very different. Your SSI check will go up and down based on how much you make at your job each month. If you are an hourly employee, this can make a very big difference in your check based on how many hours you work each month. Social Security, when looking at whether or not you are due an SSI check, has many different work incentives that they use to calculate your SSI check reduction. But I want to say right now that it is always financially better if you work on SSI. That's just the bottom line truth. And if you have questions about that, you can always ask me again, and I will show you on October the 25th when we do calculus with the CWIC. But let's talk about how that works today. So, the first work incentive that Social Security gives you is called the General Income Exclusion. And it is a $20 income exclusion, meaning that Social Security does not count the first $20 that you make when making an SSI check reduction determination. In addition, if you are not a student, the next check reduction work incentive is an earned income exclusion of $65. So Social Security does not count the first $20 that you make, and then they do not count the first $65 after that. So many people here, I can only make $85 before my check is reduced. And while that is true, that is not the stopping point for where you want to make your SSI monies. You want to make more than $85 because you're always financially better off working. When you take that $85 check reduction off, Social Security then, for every $2 that you make, $1 will come off of your SSI check. Okay, so we divide by 2, and Social Security comes up with what they call countable earned income. So they look to see not what you actually made at your job, but what they can consider your countable earned income. So half of your income minus the $85 will be counted towards your SSI check reduction. So that is the amount of money that will come off that $914 of SSI if you are eligible to receive the maximum amount of SSI. So your SSI check will always go down if you work. That is the truth. However, it is important to understand the bottom line when you're working on SSI. Even though your SSI check will go down when you work, you are actually getting more money because you're having two paychecks instead of one. You're getting a paycheck from work and you're getting a paycheck from Social Security. So two paychecks instead of one paycheck is more, and you will have more money to spend after working on SSI always. You are always financially better off working with SSI. So I want you to remember that when we're talking about SSI work incentives and working on SSI. It's very important to understand that. And you can always talk to a community work incentives coordinator with the Appalachian Regional Work Incentives Planning and Assistance Project that I oversee. And we will be happy to help you understand how that works and show you the math. But again, if you have questions regarding this, please put them in the chat and I will address them when we talk about it on October the 25th. And I will actually show you an SSI calculations worksheet and show you the math on how it works out that you get more money. Okay, let's talk about a special group of people who get a special work incentive when they work on SSI. This group is this group of students. So if you're under the age of 22 and going to school full time, you are eligible for what is called the Student Earned Income Exclusion. The Student Earned Income Exclusion applies for any student who is going to school full-time or intending to go to school full-time. So you can work during the summer and have the Student Earned Income Exclusion apply then. The amazing thing about this wonderful work incentive is it is the very first deduction that Social Security takes off of the SSI check reduction when you are working with SSI. So, if you are working on SSI, I can take up to $2,220, so $2,220 a month a student can make without their SSI check being affected at all, because that is how much I can subtract from the student's income right off the top. It is the very first exclusion that Social Security looks at, even before the general income exclusion of $20. So any monies up to $2,220 is excluded from a Social Security check reduction. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that any student that works and makes $2,220 or less each month gets their entire SSI paycheck and their entire paycheck from work, and they get to keep both. So their SSI check is not affected at all when they're working. So I want you parents out there to understand that your student on SSI can work and make money during the summer, or work or do a work program through the Division of Rehab Services or another agency that is asking them to do a paid work program during school, and your SSI check will not be affected. That's a big time work incentive for students. Remember I said last week that the impairment-related work expenses was the only work incentive that applied to both SSDI and SSI. This work incentive for impairment-related work expenses is applied when you are doing the check reduction for SSI. And what it does is it basically allows for half of your impairment-related work expense to be sort of reimbursed. It's not a reimbursement per se, but your SSI check will be increased by half of what your impairment-related work expense is. That is the impairment-related work expense exclusion that SSI allows for. So if you spend $200 on a pair of glasses, then you will get $100 more in your SSI check. Okay. Another special group of people who get a wonderful set of work incentives are people who have blindness as their disability. Like impairment-related work expenses, blind work expenses work in a similar fashion. However, remember that impairment-related work expenses must be something that is related to your impairment. With blind work expenses, it can be anything that a person with blindness spends their money on in order to work. That can include child care, that can include lunches consumed at work, that can include uniforms that the person has to purchase. Anything that a person with blindness has to pay for work is considered a blind work expense. And blind work expenses, unlike impairment-related work expenses, are excluded at 100%, which means 100% of your blind work expense will be increased in your SSI check. That is another great work incentive for people who have blindness as their disability. So those are two wonderful groups of people, students and people with blindness as their disability, who get extra work incentives when they're on SSI. There's another great work incentive called PASS, or Plan to Achieve Self-Support, that I will discuss next week when we talk about assets and resources. So make sure that you join me next week when we talk about assets and resources and how to shelter some of your income in order to use monies to save for things like homes and cars and things that you need in order to live in your community and go to work. I will be discussing how to do that and what assets and resources again are excluded under the rules for SSI. So make sure that you join me next week for that discussion on assets and resources. Thank you so much for joining me today for SSI work incentives discussion. I look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about assets and resources. Enjoy the rest of your week, and remember to always promote National Disability Employment Awareness Month during the month of October. Thank you.